Welcome back to Learning with Merit. Today we're going to talk about while loops and lists, how we can use while loops to go through lists, and how we can do lots of different things in those lists while using a while loop. And of course, this is the Python programming language. So today we're going to talk about lists first. So if we look at here, we have a list. This is the name, the identifier for this list. So it's a variable that stores this list. It has 9 things in it. And we call this little line declaring and initializing the list. So I've declared the list and initialized it, and we're ready to go. Each thing in this list, each item here is called an element. So if you hear me say elements of a list, or I use something like elim whenever I code, I'm talking about the elements inside of a list. Then different from other programming languages that maybe you have used, like VEX Code or things like that, all the block coding languages, all right, the index starts at 0. So we're working with a list here. The index is going to start at 0 for Python. So this is index 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, so on. And that can be really confusing, especially when we as humans, we like to start at the number 1. But the indexes start at 0 here. Now you'll notice the length here, I'm talking about the length now, the length is 9. So when we count length, we say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and that is the length of the list. But the last index in the list will always be 1 less than the length. So the length here is 9, the last index will be 8, and the first index will be 0. And that's a basic list for us. Now, if we want to access something in this list, because we need to know how to do this to use while loops to work with lists. And so I'm going to copy here from my other set of code and paste so you can see it. So here's accessing an item in the list. So if I want to get something from the list, I have to say, all right, the list name and then the index that I want to deal with. So if I want to print out the thing at spot 0, index 0 in list 1D, I say print and then list 1D and then a 0 in the square brackets. Now if I come over here and run this, you'll see right there the number 1 has been printed out, and that is the thing at index 0. So if I wanted to access something else, let's say I want to access the 4th element in the list. Okay, 4th element. In this case, I mean 4th index of the element. If I really said 4th element, it would be number 4 here, but the 4th index is going to be the number 5. So now if I hit play, we get the number 5 out. All right, so outside of accessing stuff, we've figured out how to access. Now, how do we change something? So if we want to change something, we need to access that item in the list. So let's say index 0, we want to make 42 now. And then I want to print that out. I want to print that out. So here we go. We're going to print it out now. I'll run that, and you'll see now it is 42. If you want to see the whole list, I can get rid of this, and I'll print out the whole list. We'll see that the 0 index had been changed. So now instead of 1, we now have 42 at 0 index, and everything else is still the same. So that's how we can change something. If I wanted to make, number 8 equal to 42, so index 8 equal to 42 here, then I can hit that. Here we go, and now we've got index 8 is equal to 42. And since I changed the code, it didn't change this over here. So that's how we change something. If we want one more thing we're going to need here, is getting the length of a list. So sometimes we have really long lists, and it's not that easy to go through and just count the number. And, who wants to really sit there and count anyway, when we can make something that will work for literally any list, and you don't have to go and change it every time. So we need the ability to get the length of a list. So to get the length of the list, here I just create a variable called length, and I say len. Now this right here, len here, L-E-N, is a function, so it has parentheses right next to it, and this function is going to bring back a number. We call that return. When it brings back something to the program, it's going to return the length of the list. So you can think of it as it goes through and counts how many things are in this list and brings back that number. So I could just take this right here and stick it right there, get rid of all of that, and hit run. And you'll see it brings back 9. Just like I told you up here, the length is equal to 9, even though the last index is 8. Now, this is an important concept. That's why I've mentioned it a couple times. The last index is 1 less than the length of the list, and this right here Just this piece allows us to get the length of the list. And as you saw, it printed out the number 9. All right, so now what we're going to do is we are actually going to set up a while loop to iterate through the list. And iterate just means to loop through. So based off of the stuff we've done in the past, there's going to be a few things that are different. So first of all, we're going to use index instead of count like we did that last time. And it honestly doesn't matter what we use here. Okay, but we want to use stuff that makes it easy for us to work with. And in this case, the word index makes a lot more sense because that is where we are going to be using that variable. It's going to represent the index we want to be at. So this is our start for our while loop. And our starting index in Python is usually 0. So that's why I have it set to 0. Then we need to create our while portion of our code. So now we have while index is less than something, right? Just as a placeholder for right now, and then you'll see there's nothing there. This is our stop, as we've talked about before, and the stop is usually at the end of the list. Now we talked about the length function. We're going to be able to use that length function to figure out the end of the list. And then I added this right here. We want to make sure we indent 2 spaces for code inside the block. And in this case, it is inside the while block. So you'll see we are indented 2 spaces under the word while to represent everything inside, I should say, the while loop. And then at the end of this while loop, add a couple spaces here, we have the increment step. Here we are going to increment index, usually by 1, and then we're going to unindent again to leave the block, just like that. So now we're going to talk about looping through a list from beginning to end. We already have this nice list up here that we can already use. And here we have some stuff down here to work with. So the beginning of a list is always going to be the first index, and that index will be 0. And then the end of the list, while we could go through and we could count, we could say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, but we see the last index is 8. So we could be indexes less than 9, right? Because we want to go up to 8. Or we could do while the index is less than or equal to 8 like that. That would also work. Okay, and then we come down here to our step, and we're going to step by 1, and then we can do what we want to. All right, so we can loop through the list from beginning to end, and then in this case, we can do something really simple. Let's just print out. Okay, let's print out what we're working with here. So let's print the item at each index. So I could say print. Instead of just saying index this time, because we don't want the number, we actually want what is stored at that place in the list. So we're going to add a little something different. We're going to say list 1D. And then in the square brackets, that's where we're going to put index. All right, so just like I showed you a second ago, this is us accessing an item in the list. And in here is the index we want to be at. And since that index is going to change every time we loop, that allows us to go through each item. And at the end, what I'll do, as we have been, we'll say end equals, and then we could add a space, but we could also add this little straight line character called a pipe and see what it does. So let's see if that loops through the list for us. And look at that. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, just like we expected. So we started at the first index, which is 0. We went all the way to the last index, and we incremented by 1 every time. And this is how we go up. You want to find what's the end, what's the start, okay, and then what do you want to do. Now, if we had done something like this, if we made a mistake, it's going to give you an error. If you go outside of the list, so going all the way to 9 would throw us an error. See, it's not doing anything. You're not seeing anything. We've got an issue going on. But 8 is correct. All right. We actually call this error when you go outside the list. We call it an index out of bounds error. And you will see that usually on your output. And it'll say you went outside where you're supposed to be. And we don't know what to do. And that's what the computer's trying to tell you. And that just means you need to fix your numbers in here. Now, let's make one that would work for any length list, right? The list could be however long we want it to be. In fact, just to show you, I'm going to copy this list right here and make it 2 times the size, just like that. Well, now I got to go through and count again. I don't want to do that. I don't want to have to ever do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use that length function. I'm going to say length, all right? And then I'm going to say what list? List 1D, just like that. So that gets the length of the list. But the length of the list is 9, and we don't want to go all the way up to 9. So we need to make sure we do one of two things. Either we use a less than symbol here so that we only go up to 8, or if you really like using your less than or equal to sign, you need to subtract 1 like that. Okay? And if you subtract 1, it will work, and I'll show you. So we do that. See, it printed the whole list for me. If I get rid of the subtract 1 and get rid of the equals, it will also work. See, did the same thing. One more time. There we go. Same thing. Working perfectly. Now we're going to talk about looping through a list backwards. So we've got this super long list that we've created, and let's say that we want to go from here all the way at the end, all the way back to the beginning, right? And that can be a little frustrating, especially if you're like, well, what's the point of doing that? Sometimes you need to. There are a lot of different problems out there, and the ability to control how our code works is really powerful. So where are we going to start? Well, we want to start at the end of the list. Well, the easiest way to do that, and I really should say, instead of the end of the list, I should say the last index of the list. And that is because we don't want to start at the length of the list, okay? Length will be, let's say 9 and 9, that should be 18. The length should be 18 now, right? So rather than saying, actually instead of 18, it would be 17 to start at the last index. We don't want to have to figure that out. It's a waste of our time. Okay, let's be good, lazy programmers and use some built-in functions here. So here we're going to get the length, and I want to know how long this list is. And so I'm going to say list 1D, just like that. Now the only other thing we need to make sure of, because this is a very common mistake, you say length list 1D and you end up with an error. The length is always one more than the last index. So if we need to start at the last index, we subtract 1 from the length. Then we say while index is greater than or equal to, well, what's the very beginning index? 0, greater than or equal to 0. And you could also use greater than -1, and that would also work, and you may see people do that. Then of course we're still going to access the item here. We're going to print list 1D index, right? And I've got my little pipe there. And then we need to make sure that we're going down now, because otherwise we add 1 to the end of the list and we're just going to keep going up and it's not going to work. We want to go down the list now, starting at 17, working our way back down to 0, so we subtract. So if we do that, then what we should see is that it starts at 9 here, goes 9 to 1, and then 9 to 1, looping backward through the list, and I didn't have to retype all of that out. That would have been a real pain. Sit there and waste a lot of your life doing that. Okay? Made it really simple for us. So now we want to talk about going from the middle of an index to the end, or I'm sorry, middle of a list to the end. Right? And so I don't want to start right here all the way at the beginning. I want to start in the middle somewhere. Okay? And there's a trick for this. Instead of going through and counting, because we don't want to do that. You can have really big lists. You're going to waste a lot of time doing that. So we're going to use that length function again. So we're going to say length of list 1D. And then how do you get the middle of something? And another question could be, how do you get half of something? Well, you can divide by 2. So we divide it by 2. But what about odd numbers? What about numbers like 9, where when you divide by 2, you get 4.5? Do you see any indexes on there that are half of an index? Well, we need a way to solve that. And the easiest way to solve that is we use another function. And I'll show it to you right here. It's int with a 2 parentheses right here. And we're going to do something called casting. So if I say int, and then surround that whole thing we just did in parentheses, what that does is it converts the answer to an integer. So, for example, if you got the answer 4.5 from dividing 9 by 2, int would convert that to 4. And that works just fine for us because, and I'll show you exactly why, we're using the length. The middle index, though, for 9 would be 4. Right? So here's our 9 numbers starting at 0. The middle index is 4. If we divide 9 by 2, we get 4.5. When we turn that into an integer just by cutting off the decimal, we're not rounding. This is not rounding. That could be 4.7, 4.8, 4.9. It's not going to round up to 5. We're not rounding. We just cut the decimal off. Okay, we call this truncating. So you just get the number 4. We cut the decimal off, we get the number 4 when we turn it into an integer there. So now we're actually working with the correct numbers. So now we're starting at the middle index. Where do we want to stop at? Okay, where do we want to stop at? We want to stop at the end. So we're going to say less than, and then the length of the list, right? Less than the length of list 1D, just like that. Or of course you could do less than or equal to list length list 1D minus 1, if you like that better. Our step, we want to go up by 1. We have a plus there and we have a 1 there. Looks like we're doing good. Everything's indented correctly. Let's see how it did. So there, it just did the second half of the list, right? Went from that 1 to that 9. That's exactly what we wanted it to do. What if we wanted to go from the middle index though? So we went from middle to the end. What if we wanted to go from the middle to the beginning? Well, all we need to change is our stop and our step to fix that. We've already created where we want to start at, which is the middle of the list. So we need to stop at the beginning of the list. So while index is greater than or equal to 0, or you could just do greater than -1, whichever one is easiest for you, or whichever one you like best, honestly. And then index plus equals 1. Well, we want to go down the list from the middle to the beginning, so it's subtracting 1 this time. We hit play. Now you'll see a little bit of a different thing here. We did, let's see, did we have it go the correct direction? Started at 1, went all the way back to the beginning, right? So it's working its way backwards. Right? So if we only wanted to get here, now this is the middle of the index, right? This is the middle of the index here. If we only wanted to get just from 9 to 1 there, well, what would we change? Well, we would change where we were starting at. We could literally just do -1 up here, like that if we wanted to. And then you see you start at the 9 and you go backwards from here to here. Okay, you could do that too. Both of those are correct. But this right here will take you from the middle of the list all the way back to the very beginning of the list. And it may not seem like it, but that 1 right there is in fact the middle of the list. All right, that's it for this one for while loops and lists. And hopefully you learned something about going back and forth, up and down through lists and what to do with them. And thank you for watching.